Alright class, this is our first Edmodo lesson. What we're going to have here is our governments of East Asia. Now there are multiple different governments that we have here. Also there's a lot of technical terms that we have to know, so unfortunately we have to do some vocabulary. As we go through here, we're going to have the vocab words show up and you're going to need to write down the definition. I've given you the word, you write the definition. If it's going too fast for you, then you're more than welcome to hit pause, get everything written down. You can rewind a little bit to listen to what you've missed, or you can keep on going. Either way, we need to make sure that we have all of the information because at the end of this PowerPoint, there is going to be a quiz. When we get past the vocabulary, there's going to be charts that we fill in, and we're going to talk about some stuff, and I'm going to tell you some things to write down. I'll try to write them down on the screen as well, as long as I don't forget. So let's make sure that we get all the information so that way it helps you out tremendously for your test. Our first word that we have is limited government. Limited government is a government where the leader has limited control because there is a constitution in control of it. A great example of this is the United States of America. Remember, we have a constitution that tells the government what you are and are not allowed to do. Remember, President Obama has to follow it. He can't do anything other than what it says in the Constitution. Our next word that we have is unlimited government. This is the complete opposite. This is a government where the leader has unlimited control. They can do what they want at any time during the day. If they feel like taxing you more, they're more than welcome to do it. So that's going to be a big issue, is the differences between limited and unlimited government. I know we've talked about both of these before, but we just need to go ahead and review them a couple of times. So we need a good example of this would be Russia during the communist era or Cuba today. The next term that we have is totalitarianism. This is a government with total control. Remember, we've talked about this before. If you underline total in totalitarianism, that should help you out. The government has total control. It's an unlimited government. And so we're going to have opportunities to look at these and just be aware of them. We're going to have some examples that we list out later of how this has worked in East Asia in the past. Sorry, I think the words might have skipped around a little bit, but the next word that we should have is democratic. This is where a government where the people elect their leaders. People elect their leaders. That way you have a say in government. You vote. Voting is super important in most parts of the world. It's a limited government as well. An example of this again is America or Japan or even Taiwan. So we have a lot of examples of democracies all across the world. Our next word that we have is emperor. Emperor is a leader of a country. It's similar to a king. It's inherited. When one king dies, one emperor dies, his son traditionally takes his place. It's existed in many countries, especially like China and Japan. So you need to make sure that you have these two examples down as countries that have emperors, okay? Countries like China and Japan. The next term that we have is dynasties, okay? This is where one family continues to control the government for multiple generations. So that means that I have a son. When I die, he takes over for me. Then when he dies, his son takes over. If they have daughters and don't have sons, they usually try to marry them off into other leaders and bring their sons into the fold. That way they continue the dynasty. And they're always going to have lots of different names. For instance, in China, they're going to have dynasties like the Ming dynasty or the Qin dynasty. We're going to have multiple dynasties. This is how China especially the emperors controlled the country, is that one family was in charge over and over and over. The next term that we have is constitutional monarch. This is a country where a king or a queen is in control, but they're limited by a constitution. For example, sorry about the bell there, that just happens, what happens when you're in a school. But for example, Japan today, they still have a monarch in charge of their country. They still call him emperor. But the problem is he doesn't get the power to do what he wants to. The prime minister of the country gets to do what the Constitution says. So the emperor is there in title only, not in power. So they kind of get paid to walk around, wave, and feel kind of good about that. So it's a limited government as well. So we need to remember it's a government with a monarch, but they're controlled by the Constitution. And our last term that we have is communism. We've talked about this government system before, but we're just going to look over it one more time just because it does play a major role inside of East Asia. Communism is a government and an economic system in which government controls all decisions. So they tell you what you're going to make. They're going to tell you how much money you're going to make. They're going to tell you how many items to make. They're going to tell you what you're allowed to have. They're in total control. This would also be a version of totalitarianism. Today, there are two major governments inside of East Asia that are this way, and that is China and North Korea. You need to make sure that you write down those two examples of China and North Korea. And this is all of the different terms that we need to know. The next thing that we're going to look at is how government has changed in East Asia. Now remember, government doesn't stay the same. It always changes. Remember, in America, we had a king in charge of our country. Now we have presidents. We elect our leaders. It happens like this over and over in many different countries. And that's kind of what we're going to look at. We're going to just talk about a little bit of this stuff. Make sure as we go through here, you fill out the charts as you see on your notes page. So the first one that we have is historically totalitarian governments. These are governments in which we had, they were totalitarian, that the government had total control. And some of them are still there today. Japan is a little bit awkward. It has changed from a totalitarian government into being a very open government where you have people elected, more of a democracy. So Japan, they had emperors that were in charge for a long time. Same thing in North Korea and same thing in China. Now these emperors only lasted for a short amount of time. Some of them were very popular, others were not. These emperors are very harsh on their people, as it says down here. Today, it's still the same in North Korea and China. It's changed a lot in China, in Japan, especially since World War II. So we need to make sure that in our column where it says historically totalitarian government, you have Japan, North Korea, and China listed out. Governments today inside of East Asia, we have South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan are all democratic governments. Now, Japan, like we said, has changed since World War II. Taiwan they believe they're part of China, but they're kind of running their own type of government. And so they do not want to be associated with the communist leaders. So Taiwan's a little bit different compared to China, mainly because they are a democracy. And South Korea is also a democracy. They fought during the Korean War to keep democracy, as North Korea, as you see is over in the communist column, They continue to fight to try to keep communism spread its south. And so we had a long war in the 50s, right after World War II, about how communism should be spread. And a lot of people were trying to stop it. The United States got involved in many wars trying to stop that from happening. And so that's why South Korea and North Korea are still split today in that demilitarized zone that's in between them. So we need to have in our governments today, democratic governments are South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. You need to remember those three. And our communist governments are China and North Korea. And our last thing that we have on our government notes is the historical development of China's government. And it's not just China, it's also Japan. Please excuse my little PowerPoint here. You can see I made a mistake. It happens. We all know that. So what we have here is that in China, they originally started with emperors and dynasties. Remember, emperors were the leaders, kind of like a king, and dynasties. When one dies, the next one takes over. But during and after World War II especially, they moved from emperor and dynasties to the communist government that they have today. They wanted to make sure they changed completely. And now today we're even seeing a small change. Remember, who's in charge of communist decisions? It's the government. They decide the economy. And now today we're seeing them moving more towards capitalism. And remember what capitalism is. This is where individuals get to make decisions on what type of economy is made. So we can add this down here saying capitalism is more current. So that way we know that there is a change coming. And it's looking like it's going to be a pretty big change in China. But in Japan, we had the emperor at first. And these emperors, they've had many different names. We've had groups called shoguns, which were warlords that controlled different territories. This is where the ninjas came from. All those fun things that you've seen through your lifetimes. In Japan, they were all controlled by the emperor, though. And the emperor, the last emperor that had total control was Emperor Hirohito, and he lost control in World War II. He's the one that declared war on America, and he turned around and attacked Pearl Harbor. After this, after Japan lost, they went from there to being a constitutional monarch. And when they became a constitutional monarch, we still allowed them to have that leadership in charge, but they didn't get to make the decisions. Today, their big decision maker is the prime minister, and we're just going to use the initials PM, and we're not talking about afternoon, even though I would like to take a nap too. But the prime minister, he is going to be able to say, all right, here's the decision on this, here's on the decision on this, based on how the legislature has voted. So these are all the pieces of information that we need to know for our test when it comes to how the government has changed between the vocab words and in the historical development all the way through today. All right. And if you have any questions, just raise your hand and ask. I'll be in here. All right. Have a good one.